first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this today. Fascinating perspectives and such an important topic. So I thought that I would enter this conversation from a slightly different point of view. In our lab, we're very interested in thinking more deeply about the neurobiology around place, and thinking about sort of how understanding some of that work can really begin to have a place in a larger conversation about what cities look like and what they mean at a very deep human level. So I'm just going to talk about a couple of topics, and then maybe spend 1 or 2 minutes just kind of trying to pull some of that together. So this area around sensation and perception, I think, is really important. We know so much about how we bring the world in from a neurobiological level, and how that really changes us. And as I think Itai so beautifully said in his talk, that we think that we are really sort of separate from the world, but in fact, there's a very porous membrane between us and the world, and every environment really dramatically changes us. And so these sensory inputs are critically important. Obviously, when we think about genetics and conditioning and life experiences, we think about this idea of enriched environment, what that does to our very biology at a cellular level, and also from an epigenetics level. So thinking about perception, so not only how the world comes in, but how we individually perceive how the world comes in based on those other variables that I mentioned. So I feel like this idea around the neurobiology of sensation and better understanding of perception is really important. Secondly, I'd love to spend more time really thinking about the nature of embodied cognition. So we feel long before we think. There's a wonderful quote from Jill Taylor that says, most of us think of ourselves as thinking creatures that feel, but we are actually feeling creatures that think. And I feel like this idea of how we bring the world in and how we feel it, how our nervous system really interprets external stimuli, is super important in the spaces that we create and the way we move through space. I think in this area also, when you start to think about place and grid cells and the way that they move us, help us to navigate in the world, but also how when place and grid cells are really engaged and practiced, how that really affects memory and how that helps us in terms of cognitive, higher levels of thinking and cognition. And so embodied cognition is in some ways the mother lode of how we feel space, and being able to tie that to some of the practice around design and architecture and thinking about urbanism is really important. Reward systems, and I will also add both reward and fear. How do we respond to these spaces where we actually do feel good, and where we feel afraid, and where we feel a sense of peril or lack of protection? And we know that when we do feel reward, and whether that is dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, we are social, we are engaged in the community. When we are feeling stressed and there's a high level of cortisol, we react, we retreat, we often leave, or we freeze, or we are unable to really be fully engaged. So understanding the natures of this kind of mechanism, I think, is really important. Let me see if I can get to the next slide here. Whoops. There we go. I'll just briefly talk about default mode network. And this is really a shout out also to this idea around who we are as individuals, how we individually see the world, but also thinking about culture and where we come from and how we identify with who we are and what our identity is. And so, every community has its own identity, but every individual also has its own, their own sense of place and personhood. And so in some communities where identity have been stripped, individuals don't know who they are within the world. And so that ties into thinking right now quite a lot around social justice and inequality, but also social change. And so this idea of identity and culture and understanding who we are in a referential way, but also as it relates to the world that we live in, is another area of study that I think we could learn a lot from. I'm not going to talk a lot about decision making, but just to say that, you know, there are two mechanisms at play in decision making. One is reactive and one is responsive. And so in space, how do we really think about the decisions we make when we're in space, and when are we reacting and when are we responding, and where is, you know, one is conscious and one is unconscious. And so what do we want to be, how do we want to be in a space? And, you know, when you think about things like flow and creativity and innovation, that's very much about reflection, not reaction. Finally, implicit bias. You know, a lot of spaces are transcribed and interpreted through implicit bias. And so really understanding what are the mechanisms at play there. And finally, just to kind of bring it home, in thinking more deeply about how do we enhance health and well-being, and I would say amplifying potential, human potential within cities and communities, I think there's a real need to think about the expansion of research, looking at the way that research and practice dance together. So it's not directional, it's bidirectional, and how we can really bring that together, thinking about this idea of how do you create implementation strategies where there is a continuum between research, practice, outcome studies, understanding what's working and what's not working, and making sure that all the players are at the table. So that's the community members, the planners, the designers, the researchers, that it's highly interdisciplinary. I'd love for us to see an innovative metric in terms of a return on investment. So what are we measuring on a return on investment? And I think that comes back to some of the other speakers' talks about who's in control and who's in charge, and who is really writing that narrative and really creating that kind of narrative around a community. And that all should inform new policies in communities, what's important to us and why it's important. And then finally, I think this is really around building a field. There's a lot of conversations that are happening, but how do you build a field that really sustains these conversations and moves the research and the practice forward? So we go from conversation to, I think, more of a complex methodology around how we do this through some more informed lenses of all the disciplines coming together. So let me stop there. Thank you so much, Colin.
Thank you, Susan. That was great. A really interesting and different take on the question.